I never thought one small mistake could destroy the fragile balance of my life. But here I am, wondering how everything spiraled so quickly. My name's Emily, I'm 22, and I always thought I had my life under control. Turns out I was wrong. Very wrong. It all started a week ago. Jason, my boyfriend, had been distant for weeks, and I was feeling insecure. I wanted to grab his attention, so I decided to do something out of character. Bold, daring. I took a photo. Not just any photo. You get the idea. I hesitated for a second before hitting send, feeling a strange rush of adrenaline. I wanted Jason to see a side of me he hadn't seen in a while. But the moment I sent it, my heart sank. The name at the top of the screen wasn't Jason. It was Luke, my stepbrother. I froze. My hands started shaking as I stared at the screen, hoping it was some glitch. But no, the message was sent. My stomach twisted into knots. Luke and I weren't close. He was the type of guy who kept to himself, quiet and observant, always with a sharp, almost intimidating edge. He wasn't someone you'd casually text, let alone send that kind of photo. I wanted to scream, to undo the last 5 seconds of my life, but before I could even think about how to fix it, my phone buzzed. A text from Luke. Interesting choice, Emily. What does that even mean? My mind raced with 100 questions. Was he angry? Amused? Shocked? I wanted to reply, to explain, to do something, but my hands wouldn't move. Another message followed, short and direct. We need to talk. Talk? About what? My mind was spinning. Does he think I sent it on purpose? Is he going to tell someone? My mom? Jason? I was spiraling, and the more I tried to calm myself, the worse it got. The next morning, I avoided him like the plague. Jason didn't suspect anything, thankfully, but every time I passed Luke in the hallway or the kitchen, I could feel his eyes on me. Not angry, not judgmental, just knowing. It was like he was silently waiting for me to break. His smirk didn't help. It wasn't mocking, but it wasn't innocent either. It was the kind of smirk that made you question everything. By the evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to confront him, to make it clear that this was an accident, and we had to forget it ever happened. My heart was racing as I knocked on his bedroom door. It opened almost immediately, like he'd been expecting me. Luke leaned casually against the frame, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Hey, he said, his voice calm, like nothing was out of the ordinary. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to meet his gaze. About the text, I started, my voice shaking despite my efforts to sound confident. It was an accident. It wasn't meant for you. He held up a hand, cutting me off. Relax, Emily, he said, his tone almost amused. I figured it wasn't for me, but interesting nonetheless. My face burned with humiliation. I just want to forget this ever happened, I blurted out, hoping he'd agree and we could move past this nightmare. He nodded slowly, like he was considering my words. If that's what you want, he said finally, his tone neutral. I felt a wave of relief starting to wash over me. But just as I turned to leave, his voice stopped me in my tracks. Be more careful next time, he said, his voice low but deliberate. I froze for a moment, then forced myself to keep walking. His words echoed in my mind, sending a chill down my spine. What did he mean by that? Was it a warning? A suggestion? A threat? I couldn't tell. That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were racing, replaying every moment, every word, every look he'd given me. I told myself it was over, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Luke wasn't going to forget this. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I wasn't sure I wanted him to. For a while, I thought Luke would let it go. He hadn't mentioned the photo again, and I was desperate to believe it was forgotten. But I was wrong. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. At first, it was subtle. Luke started appearing more often. In the kitchen when I grabbed coffee, in the living room when I sat down to study. He'd lean against the counter or sit on the edge of the couch, acting casual, but his presence felt deliberate. His eyes lingered on me longer than they used to, watching, studying. It was unnerving. Need a hand with that? He asked one evening as I struggled to reach a box on the top shelf in the pantry. I jumped, not realizing he was behind me. His voice was calm, but there was something in his tone that made my heart skip a beat. "No, I've got it," I said quickly, but he was already reaching past me, his arm brushing against mine as he grabbed the box effortlessly. He handed it to me, his fingers grazing mine for just a second too long. "Careful," he said with that same faint smirk. I mumbled a thank you and practically fled the room, my cheeks burning. Why was I reacting like this? Why was my stomach twisting into knots every time he was near? This was Luke, my stepbrother. Whatever was happening, it had to stop. But it didn't. The more I tried to avoid him, the more he seemed to find reasons to be around me. A casual comment here, a lingering glance there. It wasn't overt, but it was enough to make me question everything. Was I imagining it? Was he testing me? Or, worse, was he enjoying this? I couldn't talk to Jason about it. How could I explain what was going on without revealing the photo? So I buried it, pretending everything was fine. But Sarah, my best friend, saw right through me. "You've been acting weird," she said one afternoon as we sat in her car after class. "What's going on?" "Nothing," I lied, staring out the window. "Emily," she said, her tone firm. "You're terrible at lying." "Spill." I hesitated. Sarah and I had shared everything since high school. But this? How could I tell her about the photo? About Luke? She'd never understand. "It's just Jason," I said finally, grasping at the first excuse that came to mind. "Things have been off lately." "I don't know." Sarah eyed me suspiciously, but didn't press further. "Well, talk to him," she said. "Don't let it fester." I nodded, but my mind wasn't on Jason. It was on Luke. His face, his voice, the way he seemed to know exactly how to make me uncomfortable, and yet a small, shameful part of me didn't want him to stop. That night, I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, replaying every interaction with Luke over the past week. I hated how my thoughts kept drifting to him, how I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building between us, something dangerous. The sound of a soft knock on my door snapped me out of my thoughts. My heart raced as I opened it, only to find Luke standing there, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to say no, to close the door and end this before it went any further. But instead, I nodded and stepped aside, letting him in. He didn't sit, just leaned against the wall, his eyes fixed on me. "I've been thinking about that night," he said finally, his tone measured. I felt my stomach drop. "Luke, I told you, it was a mistake. It wasn't meant for you." "I know," he said, cutting me off. "But it happened, and pretending it didn't won't change that." I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came out. He was right. No matter how much I wanted to erase it, the photo was out there, between us. "I'm not going to tell anyone," he said, his voice softening. "But I need to know." "Why him?" "Jason," I asked, confused. Luke nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah. What's he got that I don't?" The question caught me off guard. He's my boyfriend, Luke." "This isn't." "Forget labels," he interrupted, stepping closer. "I'm just asking you to be honest. Do you really see a future with him?" I wanted to tell him to leave, to end this conversation before it went any further, but I couldn't. His words hit too close to home. Did I see a future with Jason? Lately, I wasn't so sure. "I don't know," I admitted quietly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Luke's expression softened, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Satisfaction, maybe? He nodded, like that was the answer he'd been expecting. "Thanks for being honest," he said, turning to leave. But before he stepped out the door, he looked back at me, his gaze lingering for just a moment too long. "Good night, Emily." As the door clicked shut behind him, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle: relief, confusion, guilt, and something else I didn't want to admit. Luke was crossing lines I wasn't prepared for, but the scariest part? I wasn't sure I wanted him to stop. I tried to put distance between myself and Luke. I really did. I avoided being alone in the same room with him, made excuses when he tried to talk, and spent more time with Jason, hoping it would drown out the growing tension I felt every time Luke was near. But the harder I tried, the more it consumed me. Luke was everywhere, in my thoughts, in my dreams. And it wasn't just about the photo anymore. It was the way he looked at me, the way he seemed to see right through me, peeling back every layer I tried to hide behind. It was terrifying and thrilling at the same time. Jason, of course, noticed that something was off. "You've been distant lately," he said one evening as we sat on the couch. "I'm just stressed," I lied, forcing a smile. "With school?" he asked, his brow furrowing with concern. "Yeah, school." It wasn't a complete lie. Classes were demanding, but they weren't the reason my heart wasn't in this anymore. The truth was, every time Jason touched me, my mind drifted to Luke. Every kiss, every hug, every moment with Jason felt like a reminder of the secret I was keeping. The guilt was unbearable, but it didn't stop the thoughts. It didn't stop the pull I felt every time Luke walked into the room. One afternoon, as I was sitting in my room trying to study, my phone buzzed. It was Luke. "Can we talk?" I stared at the message, my heart pounding. He'd been giving me space, probably sensing how much I was struggling to keep it together. But now he was reaching out again. I hesitated before typing back. "About what?" His reply was immediate. "Everything. Face to face. Let's clear the air." Part of me wanted to ignore him, to keep running from whatever this was. But another part of me, a part one wasn't proud of, wanted to say yes. I told myself it was because we needed to end this tension, to set boundaries, to move on. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. "Fine." "When?" "Tonight. 8 p.m. The park down the street." I didn't respond, but he didn't need me to. He knew I'd be there. The hours crawled by as I tried to convince myself that this was the right thing to do. I was going to tell him we needed to stop whatever was happening, to draw a line and stick to it. But as I walked to the park that evening, my resolve began to crumble. Luke was already there when I arrived, leaning casually against a tree. He looked up when he saw me, his expression unreadable. "You came," he said, his voice calm but laced with something I couldn't quite place. "I figured we needed to talk," I replied, crossing my arms to hide how nervous I was. He nodded, gesturing for me to sit on the bench nearby. I hesitated for a moment before sitting down, keeping a safe distance between us. "So," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "What did you want to talk about?" Luke didn't answer right away. He leaned back, his eyes fixed on me, studying me like he always did. "This thing between us," he said finally. "It's not going away, is it?" "There is no thing," I said quickly, the words coming out sharper than I intended. He raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You sure about that?" I opened my mouth to argue, but the words got caught in my throat. Was I sure? I wanted to be. I needed to be. But the truth was staring me in the face, and it scared the hell out of me. "Luke, this is wrong," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. "Because you're my stepbrother," I snapped. "Because I'm with Jason. Because this, whatever this is, can't happen." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "You keep saying can't. But you're here, Emily. You didn't have to come, but you did. Why?" I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I did, but I didn't want to admit it. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and I pulled away instinctively. "Don't," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm not trying to make this harder for you," he said softly. "But I need to know if you feel it too." "Feel what?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "This connection," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things. But I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. "I can't do this," I said finally, standing up and taking a step back. "Whatever you think this is, it's not real. It's just a mistake." Luke stood too, his expression unreadable. "If that's what you want to believe, fine. But don't lie to yourself, Emily. You owe yourself more than that." I turned and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to believe it was over, that I'd finally put an end to whatever was happening between us. But as I walked home, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. This wasn't over. Not even close. I told myself not to go. Over and over. I repeated it in my head. Don't meet him. Don't give him the chance to make this worse. But when the clock struck 8, I found myself walking to the park anyway. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, a confrontation, maybe an apology, but the moment I saw him standing there, leaning against the same tree as last time, I knew this wasn't going to be easy. Hey, he said, his voice calm, almost casual. I nodded, my heart racing as I stopped a few feet away. What do you want, Luke? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze steady and unwavering. I think you know what I want, Emily. I froze, his words hanging in the air between us. This has to stop, I said quickly, my voice trembling. Whatever you think is happening, it's not real. It can't be real. Why not? He challenged, his tone steady. Because it's wrong. I snapped. We're step-siblings, Luke. This isn't normal. He tilted his head slightly, studying me. Normal? What's normal, Emily? Living under the same roof, pretending we're just family, when we both know that's not how it feels. I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came out. My mind was spinning, my emotions in chaos. Emily, he said softly, stepping even closer. I've tried to ignore it. I've tried to tell myself it's just a phase, that it'll pass. But it hasn't. Not for me. His words hit me like a tidal wave. Luke, stop, I whispered, my voice breaking. No, he said firmly. I need you to hear this. I felt this way for a long time, longer than I should have. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear him. You don't mean that, I said, shaking my head. You can't mean that. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and I didn't pull away. I do, he said, his voice steady, sincere. I looked up at him, my mind screaming at me to run, to end this, to go back to the way things were. But my body betrayed me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Emily, he said again, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. Tell me you don't feel it too, and I'll walk away. I'll never bring it up again. I wanted to say it. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I didn't feel anything, that this was all in his head. But I couldn't, because deep down, I knew he was right. I can't, I whispered finally, my voice barely audible. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The tension between us was electric, overwhelming. I didn't want this, I said, tears welling in my eyes. I didn't ask for this. I know, he said gently. Neither did I. His hand moved to my face, brushing a tear from my cheek, and I felt my resolve crumble. His touch was soft, hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. This is a mistake, I said weakly, my voice trembling. Maybe, he said, but sometimes mistakes are the only things that feel real. Before I could process his words, he leaned in, his lips just a breath away from mine. My heart was screaming at me to pull back, to stop this before it went too far. But I didn't. I couldn't. When his lips finally met mine, it was like the world stopped. All the fear, the guilt, the confusion melted away, replaced by something I couldn't explain. For that moment, nothing else mattered. Not Jason, not our family, not the consequences. It was just us. But as the kiss ended and reality came crashing back, I knew everything had changed. There was no going back now. The air between us was electric, heavy with unspoken words and impossible emotions. I should have walked away. I knew that. Every rational part of me screamed to leave, to end this before it spiraled any further. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed. We were alone, sitting on the couch in the dim light of the living room. Everyone else was out, and the silence between us was deafening. I could feel Luke's eyes on me, the weight of his gaze pulling me into a storm I wasn't ready to face. Emily, he said softly, breaking the silence. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. My hands were clasped tightly in my lap, my knuckles white. Don't, I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't listen. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, and I flinched but didn't pull away. This is wrong, I said, but the conviction in my voice was gone. I know, he replied, his tone filled with a mix of guilt and longing. But tell me you don't feel it too. I couldn't. I'd tried to deny it for weeks, but the truth was undeniable now. Every time he was near, every time he looked at me, it felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice breaking. Let me decide for once, he said, his voice low and steady. Before I could respond, his hand moved to my face, tilting my chin up so I had no choice but to meet his eyes. The intensity in his gaze was overwhelming, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world faded away. When his lips met mine, it was like a dam breaking. All the fear, all the guilt, all the doubts were drowned out by the tidal wave of emotion that consumed us. I didn't stop him. I didn't want to. The next moments were a blur, his hands on my skin, the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, the undeniable pull between us that neither of us could resist. It wasn't planned. It wasn't thought out. It just happened. And then, just as quickly as it began, it was over. The room was silent again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was suffocating, filled with the weight of what we'd just done. I pulled the blanket around me, my mind racing. What had we done? How had we let it get this far? Emily, Luke said softly, but I shook my head, cutting him off. Don't, I said, my voice trembling. Just don't. He didn't argue. He didn't say another word. He just sat there, his expression unreadable, as I got up and left the room. The walk back to my bedroom felt like a lifetime. My legs felt like they might give out beneath me, and my chest was tight with a mixture of guilt and regret. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. What had I done? The next morning, the sunlight streaming through my window felt cruel, like it was mocking me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the night before. The guilt was unbearable. Jason's face flashed in my mind, and my stomach turned. How could I look him in the eye now? How could I face anyone? But worse than the guilt was the realization that there was no undoing this. What had happened between Luke and me couldn't be erased. It couldn't be taken back. I wanted to rewind time, to go back to before all of this started, to when things were simple, and I didn't feel like my world was crumbling around me. But I knew it was too late. I got up and stared at myself in the mirror, barely recognizing the person looking back at me. My eyes were red from crying, my face pale. I felt hollow, like a part of me had been stripped away. A soft knock at the door made me jump. My heart raced as I turned toward it. Emily. Luke's voice came from the other side, quiet and hesitant. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Can we talk? He asked. No, I said firmly, my voice cracking. Just leave me alone. There was a pause, and for a moment, I thought he might push, but then I heard his footsteps retreating down the hall. As soon as he was gone, I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face. I wanted to hate him for what had happened, for crossing a line we could never uncross. But the truth was I hated myself even more. I thought the worst was over, but I was wrong. The morning after that night with Luke, I told myself that if I just kept my head down and stayed quiet, things would eventually go back to normal. But secrets don't stay buried forever. Jason, sweet, dependable Jason, was the last person I wanted to hurt. For days, I avoided his calls, his texts, his attempts to see me. I couldn't face him, not with everything I was hiding, but my silence only made him more suspicious. When he finally cornered me outside of class one afternoon, I knew I couldn't keep up the charade any longer. Emily, what's going on? He demanded, his eyes full of concern. You've been distant for weeks. Just talk to me. I can't, I said, my voice trembling. Why not? He pressed. What aren't you telling me? I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. It's complicated. Jason's expression darkened. Complicated? What does that mean? Are you seeing someone else? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't answer, but my silence said everything. Jason's jaw clenched, and for a moment, he just stared at me, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. Who is it? He demanded. Tell me, Emily. Who is he? I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. It doesn't matter, I whispered. Doesn't matter, he repeated, his voice rising. It matters to me. I deserve to know. I couldn't take it anymore. The guilt, the shame. It all came pouring out. It's Luke, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jason froze, his eyes widening in shock. For a moment, it seemed like he didn't believe me, like he couldn't process what I'd just said. Luke, he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. Your stepbrother? I nodded, unable to speak. Jason let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. Unbelievable, he muttered. I thought I knew you, Emily. But this is sick. Jason, I'm sorry, I said, tears streaming down my face. I never meant for this to happen. Save it, he snapped. You don't get to play the victim here. He stormed off before I could say anything else, leaving me standing there, broken and alone. But Jason wasn't done. That evening, my phone started buzzing with texts and calls from friends, each one more alarming than the last. Is it true? Did you really hook up with Luke? WTF, Emily? I felt sick. Jason had told everyone, our friends, my family. The secret I'd tried so hard to bury was now out in the open, and there was no escaping it. When I got home, the tension in the air was suffocating. My mom wouldn't even look at me, and Luke was nowhere to be found. But the worst part was Sarah. She showed up at my door later that night, her face pale with anger and disbelief. Tell me it's not true, she said, her voice shaking. Tell me Jason's lying. I couldn't. Sarah, Don't, she interrupted, her eyes filling with tears. How could you do this? To Jason, to your family, to me? It's not what you think, I said weakly, but she cut me off again. Then what is it, Emily? Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty damn bad. I had no answer. There was nothing I could say to make her understand, nothing that could justify what I'd done. You're not the person I thought you were, she said finally, her voice cold. Don't call me. Don't text me. We're done. As she walked away, I felt a piece of myself shatter. Sarah had been my best friend, my confidant. And now she was gone. The days that followed were a blur of shame and isolation. Everywhere I went, I felt the weight of judgmental stares and whispered conversations. At school, in the neighborhood, there was no escape. Luke, to his credit, tried to shield me from the fallout. When Jason confronted him in front of our friends, Luke didn't deny anything. He stood there, calm and unflinching, as Jason hurled insults and accusations. You're disgusting, Jason spat. You're supposed to be her brother, not some creep trying to get in her pants. Luke didn't flinch. Say whatever you want about me, he said quietly. But leave Emily out of this. Leave her out of this? Jason repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. She's the reason this happened. Luke stepped forward, his jaw tight. Enough. The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment, I thought they were going to come to blows. But Jason finally backed off, muttering a string of curses under his breath as he stormed away. Despite Luke's efforts, things only got worse. My mom found out, and her reaction was worse than I'd imagined. I don't even know who you are anymore, she said, her voice trembling with disappointment. How could you do this, Emily? How could you betray this family? Her words cut deeper than anything Jason or Sarah had said. I tried to explain, to make her understand, but she wouldn't listen. By the end of the week, I was completely alone. Jason was gone. Sarah was gone. Even my mom couldn't look at me without a hint of disgust. The only person left was Luke, but even his presence felt like a reminder of everything I'd lost. I'm sorry, he said one night as we sat in the darkened living room, the weight of our choices hanging heavy between us. So am I whispered, tears streaming down my face. But sorry wasn't enough. Sorry wouldn't fix what we'd done. And as much as I wanted to believe we could move past this, deep down I knew we couldn't. I used to think mistakes were things you could fix, that no matter how bad they were, there was always a way to make things right. But some mistakes can't be undone. Some mistakes stay with you forever. After everything fell apart, I tried to pick up the pieces of my life. Jason was gone, Sarah wouldn't return my calls, and my mom's disappointment hung over me like a cloud. And Luke left. He packed his things one night without saying a word and disappeared. At first, I felt relieved. With him gone, I thought maybe I could start to heal, to move on. But as the days turned into weeks, his absence felt heavier than his presence ever did. I threw myself into work and school, anything to distract myself from the emptiness. But no matter how hard I tried, the whispers and judgment followed me. I was that girl, the one who crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. I knew I couldn't stay silent forever. If I was going to have any chance of moving forward, I needed to take control of the narrative. So, I did something I never thought I'd have the courage to do. I told my story. I sat down in front of a camera, my hands trembling as I pressed record. I talked about my mistakes, my regrets, and the consequences I couldn't escape. I didn't try to justify what I'd done. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I just told the truth, raw and unfiltered, hoping that maybe my story could stop someone else from making the same mistakes. The video went viral almost overnight. People flooded the comments with their opinions, some supportive, others brutal. But one comment stood out from the rest, one that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't your fault. They wanted this to happen. I stared at the words, my heart pounding. Who wrote that? And what did they mean? I tried to brush it off, to convince myself it was just a troll, but something about it felt different. A few days later, I got a message from an unknown number. Luke didn't leave because of guilt. He left because he knew the truth. My hands shook as I read the message. What truth? Who was sending this? I couldn't ignore it any longer. I started digging, looking back at every conversation, every moment leading up to the chaos. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. Jason and Sarah, they had been spending a lot of time together before everything fell apart. Little comments, small glances, it all started to add up. Had they known? Had they orchestrated this somehow? I reached out to Luke, desperate for answers. For days, there was nothing. Then, finally, an email. Emily, I left because staying would have only made things worse for you. But you need to know this. Someone wanted us to fall. Someone made sure we did. Be careful who you trust. The words sent a shiver down my spine. Who could it have been? Jason? Sarah? Someone else entirely? The pieces didn't fit, and the more I tried to make sense of it, the more questions I had. In the end, I realized I might never know the full truth. And maybe that's the real punishment, living with the uncertainty, knowing someone out there had the power to destroy my life and used it. But one thing I do know is that every action has consequences, and every secret has a price. Who do you think was behind it? Drop your theories in the comments below. I'm dying to know what you think.